Welcome, everybody, to the Where Are They Now video series that we are doing in honor of 𝘞𝘠𝘕's 20th anniversary. We thought it would be interesting to revisit with some old friends and past grantees and really catch up with them on their great accomplishments and activities and where they are now, now that we're about to turn 20 years old. So today I have the incredible good fortune to be joined by Robbie Allen. And Robbie, in introducing you, there's like a multitude of titles that I could go, technically in the qualification of the Where Are They Now series, you were Automated Insights. You were founder of Automated Insights, which was a 2009 seed grant winner.
And a 2008 unsuccessful grant winner.
Wait a minute. We usually takes a while before we get into this, but are you suggesting you did not win the first time you applied?
Yes.
Oh, that's shocking. And obviously I'm being a silly goose because that's very common. And I only put that out there for people that listen that, don't understand that they don't always win on the very first shot. But in addition to that, I mean, where to go with this? Well, I remember when we first met, and actually it wasn't from you, it was somebody bragging about you. And I think it was our good friend John Austin when he was explaining to me, you have to understand this guy was a distinguished engineer of practice at Cisco, which was rare. Like it's an honorific. Like you have to stand out, in a very large crowd with a very small number of people who get that title. And as he was bragging on you to say, like, with that kind of opportunity at such a good company, he still chose to go off and start Automated Insights. Maybe that's a good place for us to jump in. I mean, I know you had activity before that, but maybe we start with Automated and see where we go.
Sounds good. And I like to blame Scot Wingo, actually, because, when I was thinking about starting something outside of Cisco, I would, ask different people, who should I talk to learn about this entrepreneurship thing. And Scott was one of the first people that came up, just like he is today. And when I met with him, he's like, "Yeah, you should do it. Starting a company's easy." No, he didn't say that, but I came away from it thinking, "Wow, this startup thing sounds great, and I might as well go do that." And so, I like to give him credit as one of the early people to help encourage me to leave the confines of a big company and all the safety that it provided, or at least that people think it provides.
Right. The perception of safety.
Yes. And I went on later to write an article about how I think that safety is an illusion. In fact, there's all these kind of hidden downsides to staying at big companies for long periods of time. And that the best thing for my career was to essentially start over and start a company. And that's what I did with Automated Insights.
Well, you couldn't have blamed him too terribly much because you're, working with him right now, again, with the Tweener Fund. We'll stick a pin in that one, though, because I do want to spend some time talking about that. So reflecting, Automated, you decide to leave Cisco. Can you, how did you plug in? So, yeah, okay, you were a big deal at a big company, but it sounded like, kind of wading into the entrepreneurial waters was new-ish for you. So how did you know, like, to get connected with 𝘞𝘠𝘕 and, other people like Scott back in those early heady days?
Yeah, so, this kind of, if I look back at my upbringing, I was raised in a very decidedly unentrepreneurial household. So my dad worked for AT&T for pretty much his whole career in manufacturing. My mom worked in manufacturing as well. I often say, I don't think I heard the word entrepreneur until I was in college. And I thought starting a business was, or running a company was something that wealthy people did. Like, I didn't think that was something that would be available to me to go off and do. I thought you had to have means to be able to run companies. And so it took a while. I was 32, I think, when I started Automated Insights. And mind you, I moved out to the Bay Area in 1998. Cisco moved me out there after an internship, and I lived out there during the boom and the bust. And I started advising some startups kind of early in my career. based on sort of the technologies that I was working on. And so I got to see startups, and obviously all the high flying startups of the boom, which eventually became the bust. And so I started to say, well, I've seen a lot of startups go wrong, and like maybe it's not that hard, or like it seems like, you know, lots of different types of people could do it. So why can't I do it? And so I kinda had this in the back of my head as I was kinda getting tired of the big company culture inside of Cisco. And by the way, Cisco was amazing for me. I worked there for 13 years, and it was great. And as big companies go, especially during that time, Cisco was great. But it's also a big company, and there's a lot of things that come along with that. And I thought, well, I had a lot of ideas around culture and building something that where people enjoyed coming to work. And I thought, well, I'd like to put that to the test. And that's kind of what got me going in that direction. And so once I decided to do this, I was like, I needed to go learn as much as I can about what are the local resources, who are the local VCs that could potentially provide funding, what are the other areas of funding. And then that's when I found out about NC Idea. And that was probably in 2007. And then, as I mentioned, I did my first application in 2008.
The application process, I mean, necessary evil. If you're going to get a crack at the money, you got to apply. We like to say now, though, and I'm sure this was the case then, that there was nothing superfluous about the application. There's nothing silly like, tell us if you were a tree, what kind would you be and why? And what I mean by nothing superfluous is if you're serious about starting this company and growing it, we're asking you questions you're going to have to answer to somebody at some time. Right. And so, was there value in just helping you organize? I guess I'm leading the witness here a little bit, and that's not my intention. But can you tell me like what was that like? Especially because this was like your first time really formally putting yourself out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a big believer that business plans are a useful instrument, if for no other reason than the act of being forced to write down your marketing plan and to write down your financial plan and to write these things down and to kind of put it on paper, so to speak. Not necessarily because anybody else needs to look at it or care about it, but just that you've actually went through the process of thinking about each of those areas. And I remember the very first NC Idea application I worked on, it provided that function for me. Now, there was one kind of weirdness to the process, and this kind of hints at my issue with it in that first year. And part of it is it did require that you read the instructions, and the instructions had a character count.
Yeah.
And it was a Word doc back then, Tom. And so they gave you a Word doc, and you have these questions, and they had a number, and that was supposed to be a character count. I read that as a word count. And so when
Oh,
I went in and I answered all the questions and I made sure, all right, how many words is that? Does that fit the number? Submitted it. And then when I got it back rejected, it was simply because I don't even know if anyone had read the whole thing, but
oh,
they
really?
instantly denied it because I exceeded the character count. And I can't read instructions. So maybe they're
Wow.
like, if this guy can't read instructions, like, why are we going to give him money?
That's fascinating. I wonder how we would handle that today, right? And like, would we just DQ it outright, or
Well, now I don't, maybe there's probably limits where it wouldn't even allow you to put in more than
actually,
you're
you know
allowed.
what? You're right. That would. We have since built everything on Salesforce backend, and now we can
Maybe that
track
would
it
be a
all.
good test. You're like, I don't know, will they actually read the instructions? Uh,
Well, yeah, and just for those of you who listen and wondering, like, well, why do you limit it at all? It's because some people believe that your propensity to win it goes by that, the weight. If we printed it, if we ever did print something on paper, like what would be the weight of the printout? And the heavier it is, the more likely you'd win. And, it's funny. I've been now, I'm going on my 10th year. So I just celebrated my ninth anniversary in March. And I've seen since I've been here, this kind of, evolution. So, everybody was tight getting things, within, but then with AI, and people that are using AI to word salad some of these applications,
yeah.
for a while there, the earliest couple of cycles where AI was obviously being used, part of the fun was like, how many catchphrases can one application have? Blockchain, AI, algorithmic, you know, large language learning model systems. In some cases, like it's just non sequiturs, right? So there is a reason, and we want to be mindful of the 80 to 100-ish core reviewers and volunteers, people that help us, that they're not just and we're very, very concise. We're very clear about that in the prep work, right? You don't have to kill us with the character or word count. Concise and succinct and grammatically correct, strangely enough, helps your chances. So, all right. So you didn't even get a fair reading on the first, but then you figure that out. Somebody clued you in that it's character count and not word count for your second go around. And then
And
you're
then I
successful.
won, and that essentially paid for my second year of operations. So it was a 50K grant that I won, and that I think my expenses at that point were like 35 because I was still working at Cisco. And so I worked at Cisco and then kind of spent nights and weekends working on the early idea behind automated insights. And so I wasn't paying myself or anything, but I did have to pay by data, and the grant helped fund that plus the little bit of server cost that I had.
And how important was that to you back in that time?
It was pretty important. I mean, part of it is like, I had zero customers in the early days, but I had this upfront cost of this data that I had to pay for. So it was just straight out of pocket for me, right? And it wasn't likely that I was going to be able to raise any money because, again, back then, you don't have like an inexperienced person that's never done a startup and has no customers, and like VCs are going to fund them. That was a harder proposition back then. And so and plus I was kind of towing the line between, all right, am I going to leave Cisco? And because the bar was pretty high for me. I mean, this is why sometimes I kind of do what Scott does now, and I encourage people to leave their big company to work on their startup dream, because I really think anybody can start a company. I don't think it's accessible to anybody that's really willing to put in the time and effort to do it. I don't think there's any we're only born to be entrepreneurs, or it's you got to have lots of money, or any of those preconceived notions that I had early on. I don't believe any of that now. I think anybody can be an entrepreneur if they put the time into it. Um, but I had this nice job that, like, am I really going to leave this for nothing? Like I'm starting with zero and I'm going to do that. And that's a decision a lot of people have to make, is like, maybe they can't
Mhm.
work nights and weekends. I didn't have kids back then. It was much easier for me to do that. And so the NC Idea grant, which also eventually led to an idea fund investment, was instrumental in helping me kind of get things started.
Yeah. So when did that happen? When did you have that epiphany? Like, okay, I can I can leave the nest, the Cisco nest, and this is going to feed my family and do great things for me,
Well, I raised a $1 million seed round. And back then, the seed round was the first round of funding. And
right?
so 2009, I got the NCI Idea grant that paid for a year of operations. And then um, I think May 10th of 2010, I signed a term sheet for $1 million seed round, which is a lot of money back then. Typically, seed rounds were not $1 million, but I had been working on this for a couple of years, and I'd gotten some traction and some interest. Um, and so I built some momentum there. And so on my 13-year anniversary with Cisco, which was May 10th, 2010, I signed a term sheet and submitted my resignation. And so that was like a big day because I was, 13 years in.
Clearly, I mean, you remember it to the day
Yeah.
specific.
Yeah. And so that was, it was kind of hard because, I was ending this 13-year relationship. And that's kind of what it felt like. Like I'd been, you know, married to Cisco for 13 years, and now I'm
Yeah.
ending that and I'm going to start this new thing. And so that was a big leap, but it was great.
No, I get that. That makes complete sense. And, I just recognize I've been remiss in my host duties here. Can you, for those listening, can you give them the elevator pitch on Automated Insights, what it did and what you were building at that time?
Yeah. So what automated insights, or AI as we called it back then, the way to think about it now is one of the first, if not the first, commercial generative AI companies. And so this was, way before the days of the large language models, and it was before you could even use machine learning to generate content. And so what we had were algorithms that would take data and generate prose out of that data. And so kind of the use case behind it was these companies were collecting lots and lots of data. This was the era of big data, which had become a buzzword around that time, where companies were starting to see that, they have all this data, but and there's more and more tools that are making that data useful, but they needed to organize it and have it in a way that can be accessed by, APIs and programs. But they weren't really seeing a ton of value out of it yet. And so the idea was, instead of just using a dashboard that tries to visualize the data in certain ways, most people would probably prefer to just have a sentence or two describe what the data is. So instead of having me decipher this bar graph and, what's the X and Y axis, what's the colors mean, you almost kind of have to be a data scientist to interpret charts. Instead, if I could just give you two sentences on what, the data, what the trend was, what was the irrelevant thing, that's way more useful to many more people. And so that's what we built a technology around, was taking data and turning it into narrative form. And again, back then it was, very hard for people to even understand that that was a possibility. In fact, the hardest thing we had to do was convince people that our technology generated the words. We'd go in and say, all right, we produced this report based on your data. And they would say, okay, yeah, sounds good, but who wrote the report? And I was like, well, our technology generated it. And it was like, but only humans write. And so what do you mean the technology generated?
Oh, isn't that crazy?
And so, like, it's crazy to think about that now. Everybody
Yeah.
sees, Chat GPT and the like produce words all the time, and it's no big deal. But 2010, it was a much harder sell.
Yeah, I mean, sure, it was witchcraft back
Yeah.
then. No, I get that. So you raised the mill, and I don't mean to use my own experiences and foist them on you, but for most founders, that's like a necessary milestone, but that's not necessarily a signal that you're going to be successful. Like you don't declare victory yet. At what point, as you were evolving AI, did you start getting the confidence like, oh yeah, I'm covering payroll, that the financial stress isn't what it was, in a good way, it's less now. Like, at what point in that trajectory did you feel like, okay, this is something? And you use the word culture, and I remember we interviewed one of your friends and another C grantee, Doug Kaufman. He made, that was a big part of our chat too. Culture, that word culture keeps creeping in. And I think it's a common understanding of any founder of really successful companies, that they understand the asset, that culture is. If it's the right culture, it can also be something to overcome if it's a bad culture. So at what point did you feel like, yeah, we're firing on all cylinders now, and I don't know where it's going to be, not necessarily like, that we're going to sell or whatever, but like we're going to be okay.
Yeah. So that part, I would say, I didn't feel good about the state of the business until after we raised our Series B.
Yeah.
And so that was 2014 that we did that. That was another couple funding rounds later. The culture piece came much earlier. And that was, to me, it's a benefit of starting a company, right? Like, I'd been inside this big 100,000 person company where the culture is kind of foisted upon you. And again, it's just going to be different because there's so many people. You just you can't do certain things when you have 100,000 people, compared to if you have 10 people or 50 people. And so to me, it was an opportunity. It was like, okay, we get to start this brand new entity, this organization, and we can imbue it with all the different attributes that I want to imbue it with. Like, what are the aspects of it that we want? Do we want it to be fun? Do we want it to, take certain things very seriously? Do we, and all of that. To me, I've always enjoyed that aspect of company building, because again, that's like, you get to, you don't have to kind of do what some other entity says you have to do. You can kind of figure that out on your own. And if you do it in the right way, it's something that enables you to be even, not only is it something that hopefully you enjoy working in that environment, but it also can propel you onward and make you successful.
So 2014, you said, was the Series B
Yeah.
raise. So how long after that did Vista come in and make you a deal you couldn't refuse?
Yeah, so we raised the Series B, it was, I'd like to say spring of 2014, and, spring, summer, I think it might have been June 2014, and then in September of 2014, that's when Vista first reached out to us.
Yeah, that
And
makes
then,
sense.
we were acquired by January of 2015.
Wow, so you were pretty fresh from the exit when we first met because I started then in March of 2016.
Mhm.
And just a public service shout out to anybody listening. If Robbie Allen invites you to a UNC basketball game, you say yes. You say absolutely yes. Now, I feel like I owe you an apology, and somehow I might have to make this up to you because I'm not a big basketball collegiate sport guy, which probably became obvious to you in about the first 10 minutes that we were at the game. But I just remember entering the stadium and we're getting closer and closer to the court. And I'm like, are we going to walk across the court and go up to the other side where your seats are? Then you pointed to these folding chairs underneath one of the backboards and you're like, oh, yeah, these are ours. And I remember Randy Meyer, who was our board chair at the time, who was part of the team that hired me. He was at that game and he texted me and he's like, how in the hell are you out sitting on the court? And I remember texting him back. I said, do you recognize the guy sitting next to me? So that was very, very kind of you to take pity on the new guy. And I really appreciate that. And it's funny, as I reflect on, 9+ years, I remember some of those early meetings. You were one of the first that like proactively, you were on a list. Like we made this, you know, top 50 list of people I should reach out to as time and opportunity allowed. And you were definitely on that list. But I think you preempted us. Like you got to me before I got to you. And that was very kind of you. And I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Y-
no, hey, I was, I've always been such a big fan of NC Idea. I mean, I always, especially I would say prior to your arrival, um, I would say to anybody that would listen that I felt like NC Idea was like the least well known best asset we had for being an entrepreneur in the state of North Carolina, because I didn't know many states that would give you up to $50,000 for free for you to go work on a startup. Like that just doesn't exist. I don't know. I mean, you know better than I, like if that even exists still to this day, but like
it doesn't.
that seems like a pretty awesome benefit to being an entrepreneur in North Carolina. And again, like no one really knew about it back then. A lot more know about it now thanks to a lot of your efforts, but that was something that I think is tremendous. And so anytime I meet with an entrepreneur, one of the, things that was in my talk track for them when I was doing my Scot Wingo impersonation was, make sure you apply to NC Idea. Like whatever, whatever you're doing, make sure you apply to NC Idea. There's no downside to it. Again, worst case, you go fill out like a business plan-y type thing, which is good anyway, like I mentioned before. In best case, you get money that's a grant that's non-dilutive, and who doesn't want that when you're getting a company off the ground? So
Free money.
yeah, it's
So I'm going to use this as a segue because, you did exactly that. You did what entrepreneurs do. You had your exit. But then what did you do?
so I stayed on with Automated Insights for a couple of years, and then decided to step back. I'd been there for 10 years from the time I kind of kicked it off the ground. And so I was ready to do something else. And so I started working on my PhD in machine learning at UNC, and that was in 2017. And then shortly after that, the head of research at Duke University approached me about starting a machine learning company. And so, I even though I was having a blast at UNC, and that's kind of my ultimate retirement is to work on my PhD at UNC. Um, I figured, especially in that time when machine learning was really starting to take off, and we kind of had this amazing team that was being formed that that was worth kind of going after and putting the PhD on pause. And so we started Infinia ML, which initially was kind of more of a data science consultancy, but we were in search of a product to ultimately build.
And that was what then, circa 2016?
So we, I officially started at the end of 2017, early 2018.
Oh, that's right, because you had to stick out. Yeah, well, yeah. As is customary, by the way, for anybody
Yeah.
watching, when you are acquired, eh, usually the acquiring entity wants to make sure that the executive management, senior leadership team, and that culture, right, that valuable culture stays intact. So there are provisions where you have to stick around. So you get Infinia going. And did you say Duke approached you? So this was a Duke startup?
Yeah, it was officially a spin out of Duke, which, was challenging for me because I'm a UNC guy. And so that, I came out of the womb a Tar Heel, I like to say, and which means I don't have the greatest affinity for Duke. And it's not rational. Again, as I explain it to my 10-year-old son, he doesn't quite understand why I'm that way. And he didn't apparently have that gene. He likes UNC, Duke, and State, which I can't fathom. But it's how I could kind of get over with it with my friends is I said, well, it's a Duke spin out, but they needed a UNC guy to run it. So,
Oh, wow. That's nice. That's a good way to put that.
but
And
it was, I mean, all the people there, they were great. I mean, the whole team, we had this all-star team of data science, PhD data scientists that, were really phenomenal at deep learning, which was this relatively new form of machine learning that was more, could take advantage of more data and more processing. It was the early precursors to now what you're seeing with ChatGPT and some of the large language models.
and so what happened to Infinia?
So we're going for a while. That we were initially funded with $10 million from a private equity firm. And the idea was, let's take this all-star team of data scientists, go work on a variety of projects across a bunch of different industries. And we were working with everybody from Walmart to the US government. And let's do that for a couple of years and then see if there's a kind of killer product that we could then go productize. And then ultimately kind of build the company for that. And I was brought in as more of the product guy, not necessarily somebody that's going to run a consulting business long term. And after a couple of years, it was we found out one hard truth of machine learning, and it's hard to generalize. And what that means is, if there's any variability in your data, the model doesn't work well. And so, for example, if you look at, say, facial recognition, you could take a picture of a face and in many different applications, you could build a model that can do facial recognition and it can work across lots of different use cases because really all that you have is the picture of a face. That kind of situation though is highly unusual in the business world. There's not many data sets that are that similar across businesses. Let's take sales data, for example. You may say, well, Robbie, yeah, everybody's got sales data and we have leads and a funnel and all that. Yeah, but your definition of a lead is different than virtually every other company's definition of a lead and how that's
Right.
used, and all the different kind of terminology around your sales funnel tends to be different enough, and it doesn't have to be even that different, but just even different in subtle ways that makes it hard for models to work across all those different implementations. So what that means is you have to retrain the model for every implementation, and then now you're looking at more of a tech-enabled service versus a product. And so that's where we got hung up. And ultimately, I decided to step back. This was right before the pandemic and just be an advisor to the company. The pandemic happened. The company kind of transitioned into a couple of different use cases, mostly around document processing, because that was one of the kind of killer features that you could do, and especially in the insurance world. And so they were able to ultimately, have a good acquisition in that space.
Good. Good for them. Was the Duke Angel Network part of the cap table?
I don't think that. No, it was just a private equity funder that we had on the cap table.
It sounded like when you started with 10 million, like that. That's a heck of a way to start.
Yeah. Well, it
Uh,
was actually another learning that, I advise entrepreneurs not to take early stage money from private equity because, you know, private equity tends to think about companies the same. And that's, whether it's early or late, like, you put money in and it generates money, and early stage doesn't work that way. Unprofitable, as Jeff Bezos says, you're in the wilderness And you may go a year or 2 years like we did, and at the other end saying, "Well, we've learned some stuff, but we're not any closer to a product market fit, and
Right.
we need more money." And that's just not a model private equity appreciates. They're used to profitable companies where you put money in, you'll get money out, and that's often not the case for early stage.
Yeah. Which, if you do take that money, then it introduces some kind of artificial pressures that the more traditional trajectory you could avoid. So again, as is the case with all these interviews, just gems and nuggets, of knowledge for these nascent founders that are watching this for inspiration. And thank you for sharing that. And speaking of nascent founders, okay, from there, you reconnect with the guy you blamed earlier for kind of plugging you into the ecosystem. And I was very fortunate to have a sit down with you. I think it was out in the park. I think it was over a beer where you pitched me what today is the Tweener Fund, that concept that's coming up. Um, you know, for the viewers, could you share a little bit like the inspiration behind it? Because you want to talk about something that's not known, like a great secret. I think the Tweener Fund, first of all, for anybody that doesn't understand this, it is one of the most active funds, not in the state of North Carolina, but nationally. So
And it
y'all
is the
are,
most active in the Southeast.
there you go. Okay. So, whenever there are these little listicles that come out, and, we're blessed, we have a very robust capital stack, but, the crowing starts like, oh, we've got 6 of those funded companies, and oh, we've got 4 of those funded companies. And then, like, you and Scott say, hold my beer, because we have funded, I don't know, 50, 60 in a given year.
145 in 3
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. Please share like the thesis behind it and why, we are so lucky in North Carolina to have the Tweener Fund. Because I think, again, it's not as well known as it should be, in my opinion.
Yeah, so it kinda dates back to 2015 when Scot Wingo, invented the tweener list, which is, can we just name all the companies in the triangle that are above kind of the idea stage, and what he calls tweeners, which are, companies above 1 million in revenue or 10 or more employees. And so it's not just an idea, because those definitely are hard to
Right.
enumerate and to identify. But if they've gotten some traction, then we should be able to find those. And so are they above 1 million and say less than 80 million, or, kind of less at that point where, they could potentially go public. So those he calls tweeners. And so he started this list in 2015, and there were like 50 companies on the list. And every year, sure enough, the number of companies on the list was growing. And, one day Scott looked back at the list and thought, well, actually, if you'd invested in this group of companies, you had actually done pretty well from an investment standpoint, because at least as far as in the again, tweener list is just triangle headquartered companies. That's the other thing. You got to be above 1 million in revenue or 10 or more employees and headquartered in the triangle, which is increasingly difficult to kind of pin down these days in the era of remote work and all that. But still, you got to have some center of gravity in the triangle. But he realized if you had invested in this group of companies, we don't have as many unicorns, but we also don't have as many flameouts.
Right.
We tend to have more, singles, doubles, and some triples in there, but very few that just go out of business, relatively speaking, especially compared to industry averages. And so he thought, well, what if, he put together a fund, and there was this new type of fund that Angel List had helped pioneer called the Rolling Fund, which was kind of this, open-ended fund. It wasn't something that you go out and you raise, 20, 30, $50 million. You essentially take commitments on a rolling basis, meaning you can take commitments anytime you want. And the LPs in the fund would have capital calls every quarter. So you agree to some certain amount, and you invest every quarter that amount for some period of time. And he thought what he would do is the fund would be focused on triangle tweeners. And so he got started in January of 2022. And I was one of the initial, he told me about it. And I was like, brilliant. I love the idea. I had invested in, upwards of 20 companies myself. So, after the automated insights exit, I started, becoming fairly active in the angel space. And after, at that point, it was, 7 years of angel investing. I was like, I look at my portfolio of, I've invested in some really good companies, but if you look at it, you're like, so Robbie, what is your theme exactly? And I was like, I don't know, entrepreneurs I like, and like, it wasn't, in some ways I kind of felt it was more philanthropic than it was like a serious asset allocation. And so I was like, I don't, this angel funding thing it's not really, in another point is AngelList had come out and said that unless you've invested in like 50 companies, you've not really spread out the investments far enough to really get a good return. That if you're only investing in 10 or even 15 companies, it's kind of no man's land for angel investing in that, your odds of getting a return are pretty low and you
Right.
need to invest in a lot more companies. And so when Scott came in and said, "You know what? I wanna do this thing where we only invest in all the tweeners, and it's pretty much if you're a tweener and you're raising, we'll invest." I was like, "Gosh," so it's an index fund, essentially, and that makes a ton of sense to me, because I also believe that you can't pick the winners at the early stage. And my analogy for this is, what's the conventional wisdom for public markets? It's that you can't beat the index, right?
Right.
These people that make, millions and millions of dollars a year investing money, and we say those people with all their data and high frequency trading and all this stuff, they can't beat index funds, and they have near perfect information about companies. Public companies have to have quarterly announcements and publish all this data, so you have all this information, and those investors still can't beat an index fund. Now how about the private markets in the very early stage where you have almost no information about companies? Do we really think that there's people walking around that can pick the winners? I don't believe it. And given my background in startups and knowing how much luck plays a role and all these things, I was like, there may be people that have better access to deal flow. You hear about angel investors in Silicon Valley that just are amazing and they,
Right.
great returns. It's just because they're seeing lots of good companies. It's not because they necessarily are knowing, oh, I can pick the Uber every time.
Right.
And so to me, I was like, all right, I'm willing to just stop doing any angel investment and just invest my money in the Tweener Fund as my kind of angel investment allocation. And so after the first quarter, when Scott did it, I was like, Scott, how in the world are you doing all this? You're running another company, you're managing all this, you're doing a lot of investments. I can't remember, maybe it was 12 or so investments that very first quarter. Like, do you need any help with this? And he said, "Yeah, actually, I could use some help." And so I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, happy to help." And so that's kind of what kicked off. And then, he kind of brought me into the fold, and we've been working on it together ever since.
Well, first of all, that's just like, again, how awesome, how lucky we are in North Carolina to have such an asset in our ecosystem. But the thing that, for me in particular that I enjoy is how many companies we share. It's so, I mean, there used to be some competition in the running. Um, Co-founders had nice amount of, NCIDF funded companies for a while, IDF fund partners as well. But Tweener Fund in 3 years has like just shattered those records. And, it seems that anymore that half the companies we fund end up getting a deal from you all. And that to me is just when the ecosystem is working right. That's part of a healthy ecosystems culture. When we have, these cascading organizations that overlap and can hand off and just keep that process fresh and fluid as we do, every grant season, come and go. Because at the end of the day, this may not be exciting to some. It is to me, but I'm weird. But like, the secret of doing this is just, you know, qualified people, sufficiently funded, patiently supported, cranking it out cycle after cycle, reviewing the data, doing more of the stuff that works, less of the stuff that doesn't, rinse and repeat. And if you have the patience and the resources and the talent pool to do that, you're going to wake up one day and realize that North Carolina is one of the best, if not the best state in the nation to start and grow high impact companies. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all about, and doing so with the privilege of working with folks like the Tweener Fund, like you, like Scott, like all these other great founders that we're interviewing for these series and hopefully showcasing as we're on our 20th year there. So, Robbie, I know I'm supposed to land the plane, but I do want to make 1 or 2 more minutes for you to talk about Bionic because I remember when you launched, this seemed like a calling more than just a business. Would I be right in that characterization?
Yeah, I wanted it to be both, but yeah, it certainly was, a passion of mine. I had, was not very happy with my, um, kind of the healthcare system that I had been interacting with for a bunch of years. I'd started to get into my health much more over the last few years, wanted to do more testing. There was a lot more diagnostics coming out that were becoming less and less expensive. There was new medicine around longevity that was coming out, and the traditional system was just not very receptive. Traditional healthcare that virtually everybody interacts with is a reactive system. And, to me, it just made sense. Like, if you can focus on preventative and if you can prevent the bad things from happening, that's going to be way better in the long term than just being really good at trying to
Right.
knock stuff down when it pops up. And, and so, I talked to my co-founder and partner, Jared Pello, and he had the same thoughts, except he comes from a medical background. Obviously, I'm more of a software person. And so we made a good, kind of pairing as a group to kind of go after trying to help usher in a new preventative program that would be available to people that were interested in trying to optimize their health.
Yeah. Jared, iScribes,
That's
graduate
right.
of Groundwork Labs.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, we even did a case study on him, years and years ago. Yeah, you know what? I think that just so nicely puts a bow on this conversation. And in case I'm being too subtle about it, drop in these names, hearing how, Robbie's connected to all of them. You've heard Robbie's name uttered by others. This is why we work at doing this for the benefit of everyone. This thing of ours, as I like to refer to. And the more we nurture it and take care of it, the better it's going to serve us all. And y'all are a big part of this, Robbie. And I can't thank you enough and congratulate you on your accomplishments and what you're doing, of course, for yourself, your family, and, what you need to do, but also serving the broader community in what you do. So thank you for that. And I can't wait to see what's next up your sleeve because I know it's going to be pretty fantastic.
We'll see. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.